Walter Harris had become something of a ghost in the town of Pine Creek. Not in the literal sense, of course. He was still alive, still breathing, still taking slow, deliberate steps along the dusty roads that lined the edge of the Georgia countryside. But in the eyes of the townsfolk, Walter was one of those people who had simply faded into the background, the way old barns sag and vanish behind overgrown weeds. He lived alone in a creaking wooden shack at the far end of Miller's Field, where the pine trees met the sky and the roads turned to gravel. The roof was patched with tin sheets and duct tape, and the windows had long since lost their glass, replaced by plastic tarps that rustled in the wind like worn-out sails. Walter didn't mind. He said the wind had a voice, and he liked to hear it sing at night.
At 67, Walter moved slowly.
His back had stiffened with age and the kind of labor that wears into the bone, years of hauling, lifting, repairing fences, baling hay for other men's farms. He had no pension, no savings, and no family. At least, none that he spoke of. The town record said he'd been born in Pine Creek but offered little more than a name and a date. The rest of his life was a patchwork of odd jobs, missing persons, and unanswered letters. No one came to visit. His only companions were the rows of cornstalks that bordered the nearby fields and the dusty porch chair where he spent most evenings, staring into the distance as if waiting for something, or someone, that never arrived. He wasn't unfriendly. He'd tip his hat if you passed him by, nod quietly if you offered a greeting. But people didn't linger around Walter. They whispered that he was off. That he talked to himself. That he had once buried a whole crate of canned beans in his backyard because he thought the government was coming for his food. Still, he wasn't dangerous.
Juste, forgotten.
Walter got by on odd jobs, cleaning out sheds, fixing fences, occasionally feeding cattle for the Miller family when their ranch hands were short. They paid him cash, under the table. He never asked for more. He lived off beans, rice, and the occasional bag of discounted meat from the gas station down the highway. He grew tomatoes behind his shack and boiled dandelion greens in the spring. Sometimes, when the field was full of crickets and the air thick with pollen, he'd sit out with an old harmonica and play a broken melody to the stars. It was a quiet life.
A poor life.
But it was his.
And then came the dog.
It was a Tuesday, he remembered that clearly, because Tuesdays were trash days, and the county truck always made the field shake when it barreled down the dirt road. Walter had just finished feeding chickens behind the McAllister barn and was walking home when he heard it.
A soft, desperate whine.
Thin. Weak.
Carrier on the wind like the sound of a baby crying from a distance.
Walter paused. The sound was coming from the old landfill site, a dry pit behind the abandoned rail tracks, where the town's junk had collected for decades. Most people avoided it. It was littered with broken glass, rusted metal, and the ghosts of 100 discarded things. But Walter, being Walter, didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the embankment, boots crunching over shattered soda bottles and splintered crates.
The wind greloudait, mort insiste.
It was coming from beneath a pile of blackened trash bags and a collapsed wooden pallet. Carefully, he lifted the debris, and what he found underneath made his chest tighten. A dog. Barely more than a skeleton. Its fur was matted and caked with filth, yellow in places where it should have been white. Its ribs jutted out like the slats of a broken fence, and one of its front legs was twisted unnaturally, sticky with dried blood. But its eyes were alive. Terrified, yes, but alive. Walter knelt slowly, murmuring nonsense to soothe it. The dog flinched at first, then whimpered again, weakly. Easy now, he whispered.
And nobody gonna hurt you no more.
With surprising tenderness, he slid his hands beneath the animal and lifted it to his chest.
It weighed almost nothing.
Just a bundle of bones and breath. By the time he got home, the sun had dipped below the trees. He laid the dog on a threadbare blanket beside the fireplace, lit a small flame, and set about cleaning its wounds with warm water and a rag. You ain't much to look at, he said, smiling gently. But neither am I. He boiled some rice and chicken broth and spooned it into a tin bowl, watching as the dog sniffed at it hesitantly, then licked it clean. Guess you got some fight left in you, he said. He named the dog Lucky. It was meant half in jest and half in hope. Over the next few days, Walter nursed Lucky back from the edge.
The dog never barked, never growled.
It only followed Walter around like a shadow, into the field, onto the porch, even to the corner store when Walter walked there for supplies. The townsfolk noticed, of course. And they had plenty to say. Old Walter's finally gone crazy. Look at that mutt.
Bates Gotrabi.
He can't feed himself and now he's feeding a dog? But Walter didn't care. Because in Lucky's presence, something had shifted. The silence in the shack didn't feel so crushing. The wind outside didn't sound so lonely. The meals, though still meager, felt like they had meaning. Walter began talking more, not just to Lucky, but to himself, and to the memories that surfaced from the deep well of his solitude. He remembered things he hadn't thought about in years. His mother's laugh.
À Wooden Trincette.
A man's shadow at the door, one that came once and never returned. And for the first time in decades, Walter didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He didn't know then that Lucky would change his life. That the dog would lead him not just to healing, but to answers. To truth. To family. But even if he had known, he would have said the same thing he always said when asked why he bothered to take in a dog from the trash heap. Because someone had to. And I was there. As the weeks passed, Lucky grew stronger. His fur began to fill in, losing the patchy look of neglect and taking on a soft golden sheen. The limp in his front leg never fully disappeared, but he learned to move with a quiet grace, favoring it only when tired. He still didn't bark much, just a low whimper when Walter returned from errands, and an occasional growl at shadows that lingered too long in the corners of the porch at night. Walter found that the rhythm of his days had changed. Mornings began earlier, with Lucky nudging him awake with a cold nose and eager eyes. They ate breakfast together, Walter's usual oatmeal, and a scoop of canned meat for Lucky, before heading out to the fields. Sometimes Walter worked, sometimes he didn't. But Lucky was always at his side, padding silently across the dusty ground, tail wagging like a metronome set to a steady beat of companionship. People in Pine Creek noticed, even if they pretended not to. At the diner, old-timers muttered into their coffee about the dog that turned that old coot sociable. At the post office, Mrs. Hanley told anyone who would listen that she'd seen Walter smile, actually smile, while Lucky sniffed at the newspaper rack by the door. The local kids were more direct. When Walter walked past the schoolyard with Lucky trotting beside him, they ran up to pet the dog, giggling and shouting over each other. "What's his name, mister? He looks like a lion. Can he do tricks?" Walter answered every question patiently, even chuckling once when a boy named Tyler asked if Lucky had superpowers. "Don't know about powers," he said. "But he sure saved me in a way." It was the closest he had come to admitting out loud what he was only beginning to understand. That somewhere between feeding Lucky and bandaging his leg, Walter had started to come back to life.
The days felt warmer. The night less long.
And even the loneliness, his old companion, had retreated into the shadows, replaced by a quiet, pulsing sense of purpose. But not everyone was charmed. Earl Tucker, a wiry man in his 30s with a bad temper and a worse reputation, watched from a distance. Earl had always resented Walter. He couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the way the town pitted the old man, or maybe it was how Walter managed to survive without ever asking anyone for anything. Earl, meanwhile, owed money to half the county, couldn't hold a job, and lived with his cousin in a trailer that smelled of gasoline and mold. What irked him most, though, was the rumor. It had surfaced years ago, something about Walter having found money once.
Burier money.
Some said it was a box of old war bills hidden during the Depression. Others whispered that Walter's father had been a bootlegger who stashed thousands under the floorboards before vanishing. Earl didn't know if any of it was true, but in his mind, Walter had something, and he didn't deserve it. "Old bastards got gold hidden out there, I swear," Earl said one night at Jake's bar. "That shack ain't much, but there's stories. My daddy told me Walter's folks were sitting on a pile." Jake, the bartender, rolled his eyes. "Your daddy also said he once dated Marilyn Monroe."
Meb dont tekevri tel la gospel.
But Earl wasn't listening. The seed had been planted, and like all weeds, it began to grow. Meanwhile, Walter's days with Lucky settled into a comfortable routine. They walked to town twice a week, bought the same groceries, beans, eggs, a bit of meat when it was discounted. Walter had started buying dog food too, the cheap kind that came in 20-pound bags with faded labels. The clerk at Langley's Market once asked if he needed help carrying it. Walter declined. "I may be old," he grunted, "but I ain't broken." One Friday evening, just after the sun dipped below the ridge and the sky turned the color of bruised peaches, Walter sat on his porch with Lucky at his feet. The dog's head rested on Walter's boot, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with steady breath. It was peaceful. Until Lucky sat up suddenly. He didn't growl. Not yet. He just stared, ears twitching, nose lifted, as if catching a scent the wind had carried from far away. Walter followed his gaze toward the edge of the woods, where the shadows ran deepest. "What is it, boy?" Walter asked. Lucky didn't answer, of course. But his body stiffened, and a low, throaty rumble escaped his throat. Walter stood slowly, his joints cracking with protest. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. "Just a deer maybe," he muttered. But Lucky didn't lie back down. That night, Walter didn't sleep well. He kept the shotgun by his bed, loaded and propped against the wall, something he hadn't done in years.
Outside, the wind picked up, and the tarp over the windows flapped like psychoked in a storm.
In the morning, everything seemed normal. Walter fed Lucky, walked the perimeter of the property, checked for tracks. There were none. Just his own boot prints, the dog's paw marks, and the brittle trails of field mice. But that feeling didn't leave. Over the next few days, Walter noticed odd things. The garden gate left open when he was sure he'd closed it. A footprint too large to be his near the shed. A rustling outside at night that stopped the moment he sat up in bed. And always, Lucky watching. Then one Tuesday it happened. Walter had gone into town to pick up supplies. When he returned, the door to his shack was ajar. Not wide open, just cracked, as if someone hadn't had time to shut it properly. Lucky wasn't at the door.
Panique itoilter-like à Poncheto's chest.
He rushed inside, calling Lucky's name. The place had been ransacked. Drawers pulled open, cushions slashed, the floorboards near the fireplace pried up with a crowbar. Someone had been looking for something. Something they were sure was there. Then he saw it. A trail of blood. Small, smeared spots leading from the kitchen to the yard.
And there, by the edge of the woods, lay Lucky. Motionle.
Walter stumbled forward, his knees threatening to buckle as he crossed the threshold of his porch and rushed toward the yard. Lucky was lying on his side near the tree line, barely a dozen feet from the house. The golden fur that had grown so full over the last weeks was matted now, darkened by streaks of blood. "Lucky," Walter gasped, dropping to his knees beside the dog. Lucky stirred at the sound of his voice, a weak flicker of his tail the only response. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy with pain, but still aware. Walter's hands, gnarled and calloused, moved over Lucky's body, searching for the source. It was a gash across his left flank, deep and jagged, like from a sharp object, glass or maybe a blade. Whoever had broken into the house hadn't just been looking for something, they had hurt Lucky when he tried to defend it. "You tried to stop them," Walter whispered.
"You brave little fool."
His voice cracked. He hadn't cried in decades, not when he lost his mother, not through years of grinding solitude, but now tears welled in his eyes and slipped down his cheeks, unchecked. He scooped Lucky up, cradling him against his chest, and carried him back to the shack. There was no car. No one in town would give Walter a ride, not out of cruelty, but because he never asked. But this time, he did. He called up the Millers, the family whose cattle he had fed for years, and when Mr. Miller answered, Walter's voice was urgent. "I need to get to a vet. My dog's been hurt." 10 minutes later, a dusty pickup pulled up out front. Miller didn't ask questions, just nodded at the bloodied towel wrapped around Lucky and opened the passenger door. The nearest vet was 40 miles away, just outside the county line. Walter sat in silence during the ride, Lucky limp in his arms, the towel slowly turning crimson. He barely noticed the open fields blurring past, the rusty fences, the billboards advertising discount feed and fertilizer. At the clinic, a young woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor took Lucky from his arms and disappeared behind swinging doors. Walter remained in the waiting room, hunched in a chair, staring at the floor. It was an hour before the vet returned. "He'll live," she said. It was close. Deep laceration, but missed any vital organs. "We cleaned and stitched the wound. He'll need rest, medication, and someone to keep him from reopening the stitches." Walter let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I can pay," he said quickly. "I got some saved."
The vet shook her head.
"You don't worry about that right now." He wanted to argue, but her voice left no room. Walter spent the night in a cot beside Lucky's cage, stroking the dog's head as he slept. In the early hours, When the clinic was silent, Walter whispered to him.
I don't know what idée doif he lost you.
The next morning, the vet gave him antibiotics, gauze, and instructions. Mr. Miller returned to drive him home. Lucky lay across Walter's lap the whole ride, dozing but alive. Back at the shack, Walter set up a sleeping mat near the fireplace and placed Lucky gently upon it. For the next few days, he didn't leave the property. He fed Lucky by hand, cleaned the wound, and kept a loaded shotgun by the door. He knew who had done it.
Earl Tucker.
There was no proof.
No footprint, no witness.
But Walter didn't need it. Earl had been sniffing around for months. And the way the house had been searched, it wasn't random. Earl was looking for something specific. But what? Walter thought back to the whispers that had followed him all his life. The rumors of buried money.
Haï d'une inhéritance.
A past that never quite added up. His mother had never spoken much of his father. She'd said he left when Walter was a baby. No letters. No visits. Just a name that appeared once on an old birth certificate, Robert D. Harris. Walter had always assumed his father was a ghost.
Dead or gone. Nothing more.
But now. That night, as Lucky slept and the fire crackled low, Walter sat at his kitchen table with an oil lamp and a pen. He pulled out the old shoebox where he kept his meager belongings, a few photographs, a pocket knife, a receipt from 1974 with his mother's handwriting. And at the very bottom, a folded envelope he had never opened. He didn't even remember where it had come from. Yellowed with age, addressed to Walter Harris, with no return sender. It was sealed with wax, old-fashioned, bearing an unfamiliar symbol, a circle split by a diagonal line.
Et hésita-t-elle.
Then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, written in cursive. To my son. If you are reading this, it means the past has finally caught up with us. I did not leave because I wanted to.
I left because he had to.
There are things I did, things I regret. But I never stopped thinking of you.
I did something beneath the place first meilleur modeur.
If you found this letter, maybe you're ready to know.
R. D. Harris.
Walter read it 3 times, his hands trembling. He didn't remember his parents ever talking about how they met. But he did remember one story. His mother once mentioned a small clearing by the creek, where she used to pick wildflowers before the land was sold to the state. That was 50 years ago. Maybe more. But it was a place.
A direction. And now, Meb, a purpose.
He looked down at Lucky, still sleeping, chest rising and falling. We've got something to find, boy, he whispered. The next day, Walter went into town.
Not to the dîner.
Not to the grocery. But to the county records office. He needed maps. Old ones. And answers. The records office in Pine Creek wasn't much more than a converted trailer at the edge of town, tucked between the firehouse and the storage units. Most of the files inside were yellowing, handwritten, or typed on brittle paper with fading ink. The woman behind the desk, Margaret Lacey, had worked there for 30 years and guarded the old county maps like sacred scrolls. When Walter walked in, she looked up from her crossword puzzle with mild surprise. Well, if it isn't Mr. Harris. Don't see you in here often. I need to look at land surveys, Walter said simply. From the 1960s, maybe earlier. She squinted.
That is going back away.
What for?
Looking for a clearing.
By a creek. Somewhere near where the old Lawrence property used to be. Margaret raised a brow, clearly intrigued, but didn't ask more. She led him to a set of drawers labeled by decade and stood back as he dug through parchment maps, trying to piece together the layout of a land he'd never truly explored. It took nearly an hour, but finally he found it, an unlabeled square of open space, just west of Crooked Elm Creek, noted in a 1958 topographic map. He traced the trail with his finger, from the old railroad line down to the bend where the trees thinned. That had to be it. When he left the records office, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the town square. Walter walked back home briskly, map rolled under his arm, heart racing with a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades, anticipation. Lucky was resting when he arrived, tail thumping weakly against the floor. Walter knelt beside him, scratched behind his ear, and whispered, "We're going out there tomorrow." That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat beside Lucky, lantern glowing on the table, staring at the envelope and the cryptic words his father had written.
Eat something beneath the placifirst meilleur modeur.
Was it money?
Document? Or something darker?
He didn't know. But he had to find out. By dawn, Walter had packed a shovel, a thermos of black coffee, a flashlight, and the old hunting knife he hadn't touched in years. Lucky was still too weak to walk far, so Walter fashioned a simple sling from a wool blanket and tied it gently across his chest, letting the dog rest against him like a child. The trail to Crooked Elm Creek had long since vanished from modern maps, but Walter remembered enough of the terrain to orient himself. He passed under rusted fences, through thickets of bramble, and across dry stream beds until he reached the edge of the tree line. There the woods opened into a gentle slope, and beyond it, a shallow creek glittered in the morning light.
The clearing.
It was smaller than he imagined, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by willow trees and dotted with wildflowers struggling to bloom through layers of dead leaves.
Abris tirait the grass Walter stepped into the open.
He paused, his breath catching. Something about the place felt familiar. He didn't remember being here. Not consciously. But some part of him stirred, a scent, a sound, a half-buried memory too faint to name. He set Lucky down gently, the dog curling in the shade beneath a tree, watching him silently. Walter stood in the center of the clearing and looked around. Where would you hide something? The base of a tree seemed most likely. Or under a rock, though none here were large enough to conceal much. He scanned the perimeter until his eyes landed on a spot near the water's edge, where the ground looked slightly elevated, unnaturally so, like it had once been disturbed. He walked to it, knelt, and began to dig. The soil was stubborn, filled with roots and rocks, but Walter worked with quiet determination. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. He was drenched in sweat, his hands blistered, and still he dug. Finally, his shovel hit something solid.
A wooden box.
Rough, weathered, the edges reinforced with rusted metal brackets. He cleared the dirt, brushed the top clean, and pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside was a canvas pouch, tied with twine, and beneath it, a bundle of old letters and photographs, wrapped in wax paper. Walter pulled them out, untying the pouch first. It was filled with cash, old bills, faded but intact. Tens, 20s, even a few hundreds. Thousands of dollars, at least. But it was the photographs that held his attention. One showed a man in a military uniform, strong jaw, serious eyes, dark hair. He was standing beside a woman Walter recognized instantly, his mother younger and smiling, her hand resting on her belly. On the back of the photo, in pencil, June 1960.
Crooked Elm Creek.
The letters were all addressed to Walter. Dozens of them, dated from 1960 to 1975. All unopened. He sat down on a fallen log and began to read. The words painted a different man than the one Walter had imagined. Robert D. Harris had been drafted into the army, stationed overseas for years. He had written letters home every month, promising to return. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong.
A missing letter.
A delayed telegram.
And then, silence.
His final letter, dated March 1975, was the most heart-wrenching. I came back to Pine Creek last week. I saw you from a distance, playing in the yard. I couldn't bring myself to knock. Your mother, she looked so tired. I thought maybe you were better off without me. But I was wrong. If you ever find this, I hope you'll understand. I never stopped loving you, son.
Walter sat there for a long time, holding the letter in shaking hand.
He had hated a man he never knew. Had blamed him for a life of poverty and loneliness. And yet, here was proof that his father had tried. That fate, miscommunications, lost mail, fear, had conspired to keep them apart. He looked over at Lucky, who was watching him with soft, steady eyes. You were meant to find this, Walter said aloud. He didn't know how Lucky had known to dig near the shack. Didn't know how fate had twisted itself into a path that led from a bleeding dog to buried truth. But he knew this, the past no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a story that had finally been told. He repacked the box, lifted Lucky into his arms, and turned back toward the shack. Toward home. He wasn't rich yet. He didn't know what to do with the money. But he knew for the first time in a long while, who he was. And that was more than enough. Walter didn't tell anyone what he had found. Not yet. He returned to his shack with Lucky bundled in his arms and the wooden box slung over his shoulder in an old satchel. He stashed it beneath a loose floorboard under his bed, the same one where the intruder had pried up weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Earl had searched this very spot, probably certain that Walter's years of seclusion were protecting something valuable. He had been wrong at the time. But not anymore. Walter sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, the ache of age pressing into his back and legs. Lucky was sleeping beside him, tail twitching in his dreams. The dog had been his savior in more ways than one. Without Lucky, he wouldn't have found the box. Without Lucky, he might not have survived the loneliness that had slowly eaten away at his soul for decades. He thought again about the letters, the dozens of messages from a father he never knew, a man who had loved him from afar. Walter had always imagined his father as careless, perhaps even cruel. A man who walked away from his family and never looked back. But the truth was more complicated. War, miscommunication, fear, these were the real culprits. And now, finally, Walter had something tangible of his past. Not just a box of money, but a story. A link to where he came from. But even as peace began to settle into his bones, Walter knew one thing for sure. He had to be careful. It didn't take long before the town began to talk. Mrs. Hanley saw him at Langley's market buying canned tuna, crackers, and a new wool blanket. She had never seen Walter buy anything new. Ever. 2 days later, Kenny from the hardware store mentioned that Walter had asked about new fencing wire. Strong stuff. Enough to line an acre or more. Then he was seen outside the feed store, asking about cattle prices. In Pine Creek, a town where nothing went unnoticed, these details added up quickly. And then someone said it. Loudly. At Jake's bar. Just as the jukebox clicked off and the room fell into that awkward pause between songs. I heard Old Man Harris struck gold. Laughter followed. Then silence. Earl Tucker, sitting in the corner, leaned forward with a look that wasn't amusement. It was curiosity. And greed. Where'd you hear that? He asked, voice low. From Margie at the market, the man replied. Said he's been spending money like it grows on trees. Earl smirked. I knew it. I knew he was hiding something out there. He stood, drained the last of his beer, and left without saying another word. That night, Walter didn't sleep. Lucky sensed it too. The dog paced restlessly, limping slightly, pausing at the door, ears twitching at every sound. Walter sat by the fire, shotgun across his knees, listening to the night breathe. He thought about burying the box again. Maybe deeper this time. Or hiding it in the woods. But that didn't feel right. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the story, the legacy, that had been hidden too long already. So instead, he made a decision. The next morning, Walter walked into town. His back ached, his joints stiff, but he walked with purpose. He went straight to the county office and asked to speak to a lawyer. There was only one in Pine Creek, Becky Morales, 30-something, sharp-tongued and sharp-minded, who had once interned in Atlanta but returned home to care for her aging mother. Walter explained the situation in broad strokes. He didn't mention the cash, but he spoke of letters. Family. A possible inheritance buried long ago. Année moidide. Becky listened, took notes, and said, You want legal recognition of your father's property? Walter nodded. I want to do things right. She agreed to help. Quietly. Discreetly. But secrets in Pine Creek were like seeds in wet soil. They grew fast. A week later, someone vandalized Walter's property. The garden fence was torn down. The chicken coop was kicked open. 2 hens were missing. No notes. No threats. Just a message written in silence. We're watching. Walter knew who it was. But he had no proof. Instead of retaliating, he built the fence higher. He replaced the chicken wire with barbed steel. He reinforced the door with a crossbar.
Lucky, Naustranger, patrole the perimte like a sentinelle.
And still, people whispered. Some said he had inherited Confederate gold. Others claimed he found a prohibition stash buried by bootleggers. The wildest theory was that he had stumbled across something left by the government, a forgotten crate from some Black Ops project. Walter ignored them all. Until one evening, Becky came to visit. She stepped onto the porch, glanced at the security lights Walter had recently installed, and said, You're causing quite a stir.
Walter said nothing.
She handed him an envelope. I filed the request. Your father owned that land once. The paperwork was never updated after he disappeared.
It's your now.
Officially.
Walter nodded slowly.
Thank you. There's something else, Becky added. Someone came by my office asking questions. A man named Earl Tucker. Said he was a concerned neighbor. I didn't tell him anything. But you should be careful.
Walter stared into the horizon.
I know. When she left, Walter returned to the fireplace, where Lucky lay curled beside the warming stones. He sat heavily in his chair, gazing at the shadows dancing across the walls. He had wanted to disappear from the world. To be left alone. And now, with a legacy in his hands and the whispers of wealth clinging to his name, solitude was slipping through his fingers. The past had returned. And with it came danger. But for the first time, Walter wasn't afraid. He looked down at Lucky, who opened one eye and thumped his tail once. We started this together, Walter said softly. And we'll finish it the same way. It started with a knock. A slow, deliberate knock that came just after midnight, loud enough to jolt Walter from a half-sleep in his chair. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint orange shadows along the walls. Lucky sat up before Walter could stand, ears pinned back, his body tense.
The knock came again.
3 times. Walter stood, his knees aching, and reached for the shotgun resting against the wall. He didn't say anything as he stepped to the door. Lucky padded behind him, his low growl rumbling like distant thunder. Walter opened the door slowly. Earl Tucker stood in the moonlight, hands in the pockets of his leather jacket, eyes gleaming with something between triumph and menace. "Evenin', Walt," he said. Walter didn't respond. Earl looked past him into the shack, scanning the darkness like he expected to see gold bars piled in the corner. "Heard you been busy. Buying feed. Fixing fences. Even talking to lawyers. Lot of changes for a man who's lived like a ghost."
Walter raised the shotgun slightly.
"You're not welcome here." Earl chuckled. "You know, people in this town might be slow, but we're not stupid.
Everybody knows you found something.
Hell, half of them are probably out there digging holes in their own yards hoping they'll get lucky."
Walter said nothing.
Lucky took a step forward, his growl deepening. "I'm not here to make trouble," Earl continued, but his tone betrayed the lie. "Just think maybe you could share a little. Be neighborly. I've had a rough year.
Lost my job. Truck broke down.
Figure you got more than you need." Walter's grip on the shotgun tightened. "You think you're owed something?"
Earl shrugged.
"You've been living out here for free. Sitting on land nobody even remembered until now. If it wasn't for people like me keeping this town running, you'd still be digging ditches for $1. Walter took a slow breath.
"Get off my porch."
Earl took a step closer.
Lucky lunged.
It wasn't a full attack, just a warning. He barked once, loud and sharp, then positioned himself between Earl and Walter, teeth bared, body low.
Earl's expression darkened.
"That mutt lays a tooth on me, I'll put him down." Walter didn't flinch. "You'll try." For a moment, the night was held in tension. Then Earl spat on the porch and turned away. "You'll regret this," he said over his shoulder.
"This town don't forget."
"And it sure as hell don't forgive." He disappeared into the darkness. Walter stood at the door long after Earl was gone, Lucky still bristling at his side. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He made a plan. By morning he had packed 2 bags, one with food, water and supplies, the other with the wooden box and everything inside it. He didn't know where he was going yet, only that he couldn't stay. The land was his now, legally, but that meant little in a place where envy could burn hotter than the law. He left a note on the table for Becky Morales, brief and direct. "Gone for a few days.
Keep the paperwork safe.
If anything happens to me, you know what to do." He didn't take his old truck. It was too loud, too obvious. Instead, he walked. Through the woods, along creek beds, using deer trails he remembered from his childhood. Lucky followed, limping slightly but never slowing. They moved like fugitives, silent and unseen. By nightfall, they reached a cabin deep in the national forest. It belonged to Walter's cousin, a man who had died years ago and left no heirs. The place had fallen into disrepair, but it was hidden, remote, and sturdy.
Walter lit a fire and sat in the doorway, looking out into the trees.
He wasn't scared. Not really. But he was tired. He had never asked for this. Never wanted gold or power or recognition. All he had wanted was a quiet life, a place to be forgotten. But fate, in its strange and merciless way, had dragged him back into the world. He looked at Lucky, who rested beside him with his head on Walter's boot. "You still with me, old friend?" he whispered. Lucky wagged his tail once, softly. Over the next few days, Walter laid low. He hunted small game, gathered berries, rationed what little food he had brought. But even in the isolation of the woods, he could feel the pull of Pine Creek, the unfinished business, the story still unfolding. Then came the news. On the fourth day, Walter returned to the edge of town under the cover of night. He stopped by Becky's office just as she was closing up. She was startled to see him.
"Walter, where the hell have you been?"
"Hiding," he said simply. She looked exhausted. "You need to see this." She handed him a folded newspaper.
The Pine Creek Gazette. The headline read, "Mysterious fire destroy all Harris property."
Walter's eyes widened. Below the headline was a photo, his shack, or what remained of it. A blackened shell.
Charred beam. Smoke still curling from the ruin.
"It burned yesterday morning," Becky said quietly. "No one saw who did it. But everybody's talking. They think you're dead." Walter stared at the image. "Lucky and I weren't there." "Thank God," Becky said. "But someone tried to erase you." "Earl," Walter said. She nodded. "The sheriff has no proof. But, yeah, it's him. Or someone like him." Walter folded the paper and handed it back. "It's not just about me anymore." Becky gave him a hard look. "What are you going to do?" Walter glanced at Lucky, then back at her. "I'm going to finish this." That night, Walter didn't return to the cabin. He walked back into Pine Creek. Not to hide, but to fight. Walter arrived in Pine Creek just before dawn. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft gray of early morning. The fire had gutted the shack where he had spent half his life, but the ashes had barely cooled. People thought he was dead. The local rumor mill had spun his story into myth already. Some said he ran off with treasure, others that he died in the fire with the secrets of old money hidden in the walls. Walter didn't care about the gossip. Not anymore. He walked past Langley's Market, past the feed store, past Jake's bar. He wore the same worn jacket and mud-stained boots, but he walked differently now. Not hunched. Not cautious. He moved with purpose. Lucky limped beside him, scarred but alert. By the time Walter reached the sheriff's office, the sun had begun to rise, throwing amber light across the windows. Sheriff Mark Ellison, a man Walter had known for 30 years but spoken to only a handful of times, was sipping coffee behind his desk when Walter pushed open the door. Ellison looked up, and dropped his mug. "Jesus Christ," he muttered.
"Walter." Walter stepped in without a word.
Lucky followed. "You're alive," the sheriff said, stunned. "Not thanks to your protection," Walter said evenly.
Ellison stood.
"We thought, after the fire."
"You know what you took?"
Walter pulled a small bundle from his coat pocket and tossed it on the desk. Letters. The original envelope from his father. A copy of the deed Becky had processed. "I'm not here to argue. I want a statement filed. A record. Someone tried to kill me." Ellison looked down at the documents, then up at Walter. "You think it was Earl Tucker?" Walter nodded. "I don't think. I know."
Ellison sighed.
"Walter, we don't have evidence. No witnesses. No prints. Even if he did it, he's not stupid enough to leave proof." "Then you better find some," Walter said. "Because if you don't, I will." Before the sheriff could respond, Walter turned and walked out. He wasn't done. He headed for Jake's bar. It was early, but he knew Earl would be there. Earl had no job, no farm to tend, no life outside of whiskey and suspicion. And sure enough, when Walter pushed open the door, there he was, nursing a beer, slouched in the same booth where he always sat, flanked by two of his hangers-on. The room fell silent when Walter stepped in. Earl looked up. And froze. Walter didn't speak at first. He walked slowly toward the booth, eyes never leaving Earl's. Lucky stayed at the door, watching. You tried to burn me out, Walter said, voice low and hard.
You took tu coup d'irresme.
You failed. Earl stood, the chair scraping behind him.
You got no proof.
Walter didn't move.
Ive got enough. Earl logedons. What, you gonna shoot me in front of half the town?
Walter didn't blink.
No.
But I will make sure everyone here knows exactly who you are. He turned to the room, to the bartender, to the handful of regulars who had gone pale.
Earl Tucker broke into my home.
He hurt my dog. He came back to threaten me. And when I refused to give him what he wanted, he lit a match and hoped no one would ask questions.
Silence.
You all knew he was bad news. You just didn't care until someone got hurt. The bartender spoke first. Is it true, Earl? Earl scoffed. He's crazy.
Allman's lost his mind.
Walter didn't flinch. Check his truck.
Back left tire.
There'll be soot and melted plastic from my rain barrel.
Check the gas station camera.
He filled up with diesel the night before the fire. He's not smart enough to cover his tracks. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later. Someone had called him. Earl tried to leave but was stopped in the parking lot. He didn't resist, but the look in his eyes promised it wasn't over. Walter didn't watch the arrest. He didn't care for justice born out of spectacle. Instead, he walked down the road to Becky's office. She was already there, waiting. You did it, she said, eyes wide.
Walter shook his head.
I only started it. She gestured toward the papers he had left behind. What do you want to do now?
Walter sat.
He was tired, bone-tired, but steady. I want the story told.
The truth.
About my father. About what he left behind. Becky frowned.
You mean, the money?
I mean the man, Walter said. People deserve to know he didn't abandon us. He tried.
The world got in the way.
He wrote me letters every month for 15 years. Becky softened. You sure you want that? Once it's out there, people won't stop digging. Walter smiled faintly. Let them dig. There's nothing left to find but words. And those are mine. That evening, Becky helped him draft a letter to the Pine Creek Gazette. A testimony. A eulogy.
A confession.
It detailed his father's life, the letters, the buried box. It didn't mention the money directly, only that something had been found, a legacy misunderstood. When it was published 2 days later, the town read it in silence. Some were ashamed. Some still whispered. But others, quietly, began to stop Walter in the street. Not to ask questions, but to say they were sorry. Earl was charged with attempted arson and trespassing. It wasn't enough, but it was something.
The shack was gone.
Walter didn't rebuild. Instead, he used part of the inheritance to purchase a small plot just beyond the creek, near the clearing where the box had been buried. There, with help from volunteers and neighbors he never expected, he built a new home, modest, strong, open to the breeze and the sound of the trees. Lucky had a bed beside the hearth. Walter had a chair by the window. And every day he wrote. He wrote letters to his father. Stories about the town. Memories he never thought worth recording. He didn't know who he was writing for.
Maybe no one.
Maybe the boy he used to be. Maybe the man he finally became. One evening, sitting on the porch with Lucky at his feet and the wind rustling the tall grass, Walter smiled. He had lived long enough to see the truth survive the fire. Spring arrived slowly in Pine Creek. The thaw rolled in with muddy roads and the scent of new grass, and the trees that lined the valley stretched toward the sun like they, too, were waking from something long and dreamless. Walter watched the seasons change from the porch of his new home, a simple cabin built near the same clearing where he had found the buried box. It wasn't large, but it was his. And it stood on land that now held meaning, not just memory. Lucky, older and grayer now, slept longer in the mornings and walked slower during the day, but he remained as loyal as ever. He would lie in the same patch of sun near the porch steps, eyes half closed, tail occasionally twitching at the sound of a passing bird or a snapping twig. Walter had come to think of the dog as more than just a companion. Lucky had become the thread that stitched his old life to the new. And now, for the first time in decades, Walter felt like he belonged somewhere, not hidden on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, but rooted in something solid. Something earned. He had never meant for his story to spread. But stories, like seeds on the wind, found places to grow. After the letter to the Gazette was published, there had been a wave of curiosity in Pine Creek.
Den kam the silence, à qu'un of collective pause.
People didn't quite know what to say to Walter. Some still looked at him with suspicion, as if waiting for the second part of the story to fall into place. Others, especially the older townsfolk, stopped by quietly, leaving gifts, fresh eggs, jars of preserves, bundles of firewood. It was their way of saying sorry without speaking the word. Walter accepted the offerings with a nod and a tired smile. He didn't need the food. But he understood the gesture. More surprising were the younger people, high schoolers and 20-somethings who had grown up hearing the name Walter Harris as a cautionary tale.
À recluse. Habitaire vétéran.
A nobody. They began to visit. Some came alone, others in pairs. They'd walk the long trail up to the cabin, knock gently on the post, and ask if Walter would tell the story again. Not about the money. About the letters. The father he never met. The life that almost was. He told them what he could. He read passages from the letters aloud. He showed them the photos, the one of his mother smiling beside the creek, the one of his father in uniform, standing tall and uncertain. Some cried. Some stayed long after sundown, just listening. And some returned, weeks later, with notebooks in hand and questions they hadn't known how to ask before. Walter didn't mind. He had spent his youth being forgotten. If his story could help someone remember where they came from, or what they might become, then maybe all of it had been worth it. One afternoon in May, Becky Morales visited again. She brought her young niece, Sophie, a quiet girl with bright eyes who had taken to writing poems about Pine Creek. Becky had read some of them and thought Walter might like to see. Sophie handed him a folded sheet of notebook paper. He opened it and read. It was a poem about the clearing.
About Roudburien de Rache.
About a man and a dog who watched the seasons turn. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Walter looked at the girl and nodded once. That's good, he said. Keep writing.
Sophie beamed.
Later, after Becky and Sophie left, Walter sat on the porch and thought about the way stories carried weight, not just because of what they said, but because of who chose to listen. He thought about his father again. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. Just a quiet wonder at how far one man's absence had rippled through time. The box he had unearthed still sat in a drawer inside the cabin.
Et hadn't touched the money again.
Most of it remained untouched. He lived simply, ate modestly, and only used what was necessary to keep the cabin warm and Lucky fed. Some folks urged him to invest, to modernize, to use the funds for travel or luxury. But Walter wasn't looking to escape anything anymore. He had spent his life running from the silence. Now, he embraced it. Still, he began to write more. Not just letters. But a memoir. A true account. The whole story, written in his own hand, page by page, in an old ledger notebook his mother had once used for grocery lists. He wrote slowly, sometimes no more than a paragraph a day. But the process calmed him. Centered him. And the notebook began to fill. Every now and then, Becky would stop by with legal forms or news from town. One day she mentioned that the Pine Creek Historical Society was interested in archiving some of the letters Walter had uncovered, specifically, the ones his father had sent from overseas during the war. They thought it might be valuable to the county's war records and family history projects.
Walter hesitated.
Then he agreed. If history could forget his father once, maybe this was a way to set the record right. The letters were scanned, preserved, and displayed in a small glass case at the town library. There wasn't much fanfare. But on the day they were unveiled, Walter stood quietly in the back of the room, hand resting on Lucky's head, watching as a group of schoolchildren read his father's handwriting with wide, curious eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. By summer, a subtle transformation had taken place. Not just in Walter's life, but in the valley itself. People had begun referring to the land near Crooked Elm Creek not as the Harris property or that old shack spot, but simply as Walter's clearing.
A place of memory. A place of feeling.
And for Walter, it was no longer just where a box had been buried. It was where his life had begun again. The days grew longer. Summer in Pine Creek arrived not with fire, but with warmth, a patient kind of heat that softened the land rather than scorched it.
The trees thickened.
The birds called from higher branches. And the valley near Crooked Elm Creek turned a deep, living green. Walter had always noticed the seasons, but now he felt them more intimately. The wind through the grass, the sound of insects, the way sunlight filtered through his cabin window at dawn, these small changes marked the rhythm of a life fully inhabited. But something else was changing too. Lucky was slowing down. Not just the kind of slow that comes after a long walk, or a day of chasing squirrels through brush. This was different.
À 10 perquins of tirade.
His breath was shorter. His eyes, once so alert, seemed to carry more cloud than fire. Some mornings, he didn't rise until Walter gently called his name 3 or 4 times. And even then, the old dog would blink slowly, stretch carefully, and walk with hesitation. Walter pretended not to notice at first. He bought better food, warmer bedding, carried him up the cabin steps when necessary. He even asked Becky if she knew any traveling veterinarians who might stop through the county. She made a few calls, but the answer was always the same. Old age isn't a disease.
Walter knew this.
He had outlived friends, lovers, parents. He knew what time did to the body. But Lucky wasn't just a dog. Lucky had been the first to believe in him. The first living thing to trust him after decades of self-imposed silence. Lucky had pulled him from isolation. Had led him to the letters. Had stood guard through fire, greed, and ghosts. Now, Walter could do nothing but watch time take him back. One morning in late July, Walter woke to the sound of heavy breathing near the hearth. Lucky was lying there, not moving much, but awake. His head rested on his front paws. His eyes met Walter's. And in that gaze, there was no fear. No pain.
Juste patience.
Walter sat beside him. He didn't speak at first. He simply rested one hand on the dog's back, feeling the slow, even breath rise and fall beneath the soft coat. "You were never supposed to stay this long," he finally whispered. "But I'm glad you did." Lucky closed his eyes. For the rest of that day, Walter stayed close. He fed Lucky bits of boiled chicken, brushed his fur, read him the newest chapter of the memoir he'd been writing, about the fire, the cabin, the poem from the little girl who saw something beautiful in the clearing. As night fell, he lit a lantern and sat beside the hearth, just watching. And when Lucky finally let go without struggle, without sound, Walter bowed his head and let the silence settle around him. The next morning, he wrapped the old dog in a soft cotton blanket and carried him down to the edge of the creek.
There, Benéat de Crooked Elm, et du Gao Louis Stidian.
The same ground that had once hidden letters, legacy, and sorrow now received something else, his most faithful companion. He didn't cry. The tears would come later, in quiet, unexpected moments. But for now he simply stood beneath the branches, sunlight breaking through the leaves like memory itself, and whispered thank you. For days, Walter said little to anyone. People noticed. Becky came by with fresh bread and a hug she didn't try to explain. A few neighbors left flowers at the gate. Someone carved a wooden plaque and left it at the cabin door. It read, "Lucky. Friend.
Sentinelle.
Hero." Walter hung it beside the porch, above Lucky's old sleeping spot. The cabin felt emptier without the shuffle of paws or the soft thump of a tail. The silence returned, but it no longer felt cruel. It felt earned. He kept writing. More than ever. He wrote about Lucky. About the day they met. About the broken leg and the trembling in the rain. About how trust isn't built in moments, but in repetitions, soft touches, shared meals, quiet nights. He wrote as if the dog could still hear him. And maybe he could. Months passed. Autumn returned, painting the valley in gold and rust.
Walter walked a little slower now.
His hands ached when the mornings were cold. But he smiled more. One morning, while raking leaves near the creek, he found something half buried beneath the elm. A small, worn collar. Not Lucky's, this one was older, cracked with age, probably lost by another dog long before his time. Walter held it for a long moment. Then placed it gently beside Lucky's grave. "This land remembers," he said. Later that week, Becky stopped by with news. "Walter," she said carefully, "I think you should consider publishing." He raised an eyebrow. "Publishing what?"
Your story.
"All of it."
The letters. The fire.
Lucky.
The war.
It's not just for you anymore. People want to hear it. Walter didn't answer right away. Then slowly he said, maybe. That night, he took out the ledger. It was nearly full now. Hundreds of pages. Ink faded in spots, blotched by rain, but alive. More alive than he had been, all those years ago, when he thought he had nothing left to say. He flipped to the last empty page and began to write. This is not a story about treasure. It's about memory. About what survives when everything else burns.
About a dog who trusted a broken man.
And about a valley that never stopped whispering the truth, even when no one listened. By the time the first frost touched Pine Creek, Walter had finished writing. The final pages of his memoir weren't about the gold, the fire, or even the letters. They were about stillness. About the ache that comes after love is gone, and the strange sacred peace of a quiet life earned one bruise, one kindness, one scar at a time. He titled the manuscript simply, The Clearing. Becky helped him format it. A friend of hers worked with a small regional press out in Montana, a publisher known for preserving voices from rural America. They didn't promise bestsellers. But they promised to listen. That was enough. The day the first printed copy arrived, Walter didn't open it right away. He held the slim paperback in his hands like it was something fragile. Not precious because of what was inside, but because of who he had become to write it. That night, he read aloud from it by the fire. He read as if Lucky were still there, head on his paws, eyes fixed on the sound of Walter's voice. A few weeks later, The Clearing quietly hit shelves across a handful of independent bookstores. It didn't go viral. It didn't make headlines. But something stranger happened. People who read it didn't forget it. They passed it to others. Mailed it to distant cousins. Left it in diners, on porch swings, in church lending libraries. In towns like Pine Creek, where stories were usually passed down by mouth, Walter's voice began to linger in paper and ink. Letters started coming. Not in torrents, but steadily, handwritten notes from strangers. Veterans. Teachers. Widows. Kids who had grown up in silence. They wrote to say thank you. To ask how Lucky had died. To wonder if their own fathers had meant to write too. Walter read each one. Sometimes he responded. Other times he simply placed them in the drawer where the original letters still lay, those pages his father had written to a boy he never met, never touched, but never forgot. One morning in early December, Walter stood in front of the town library. He wore his best shirt, tucked into jeans that had lost their stiffness years ago. Becky stood beside him, arms crossed against the chill. A small crowd had gathered. Maybe 30 people. Maybe more. They were there for the dedication. Not a statue. Not a mural. Just a bench. It sat beneath the crooked elm near the back garden.
Weathered wood. Clean lines.
A simple brass plaque was screwed into the top slat.
In memory of Lucky.
And the man who finally spoke. Walter sat on the bench. He didn't give a speech. But he told a story. About a boy who never got to know his father. About a box that wasn't buried for treasure, but for time. About a dog who saved a man just by staying. People listened. Some wept. Some held hands. The mayor offered to name the clearing officially on town records. Walter said it wasn't necessary. It already has a name, he said. And those who need it will find it. Afterward, a teenage girl approached him with a notebook. She was nervous. Her hands shook as she opened it. I wrote something, she said. It's not finished. Walter took the notebook gently and read the first lines. The wind told me his name. But it didn't speak it loud. It whispered in the trees. And scattered it with clouds. He looked up. That's very good.
The girl blinked fast, embarrassed.
Do you want to finish it? He asked. She nodded. He smiled. Then keep listening. Winter arrived.
It cam whisky snow en sleep.
Walter didn't mind the cold. He had lived through worse. His body ached in the mornings, and his breath came shorter when he climbed the hill. But the fire still crackled. The ink still flowed. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside his window, Walter wrote his final letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. But it was for everyone. If you found this place, then know that it wasn't built in gold. It was built in silence. In hurt. In mercy. I have nothing more to leave but this story. And I hope it reminds you that love arrives in strange forms. That memory outlasts pain. That even the forgotten carry something worth remembering. He folded the letter. Placed it in the ledger. Closed the book. A few months later, when Walter passed quietly in his sleep, Becky was the first to find him. She cried. Not because he was gone, but because he had stayed long enough to finish his story. The funeral was held in the clearing. No church. No choir. Just trees, and a wooden bench, and the sound of birds returning for spring. Walter was buried beside Lucky, beneath the elm.
À Saint-Pletstone-Reed. Walter Harris. 1939-2024.
He remembered. So we could too. Afterward, people lingered. They told their own stories. Stories that had nothing to do with gold or letters or land. Stories about grief. About dogs. About finding home. Years passed. Children who never knew Walter sat on that bench, reading from the clearing, now part of the local school curriculum. Travelers from other states made the hike to the cabin, now a historic site maintained by volunteers. And sometimes, if the wind was just right, they said you could still hear a soft bark echo through the trees. Not loud, but loyal. Just enough to know the valley still remembered.